The morning they read the will, Miriam Calloway wore the same black dress she had worn to her husband's funeral 3 weeks earlier. She had not planned it that way. She had reached into the closet in the gray pre-dawn light, her hand finding fabric by feel, and only when she stood before the bathroom mirror did she realize what she'd chosen. She considered changing, then she decided not to. There was something honest about it, arriving at the formal end of a marriage, in the same clothes she'd worn to the formal end of a life. The symmetry felt true even if nothing else about the morning did. She drove herself to the attorney's office. She had been driving herself everywhere for 42 years, even when Rowan offered, even when he insisted, because there was something about being in control of your own movement through the world that Miriam had never been willing to surrender. The city was quiet at that hour, the streets still holding the particular emptiness of early morning, and she drove through it with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind doing what it always did when she needed to think clearly, going very still. The way deep water goes still when the wind stops. Rowan had been dead for 23 days. She was still learning the weight of that sentence. Not the fact of it, she had understood the fact of it the moment she found him in his study at 7 in the morning. The coffee going cold on his desk, his face turned toward the window where the light came in. But the way it changed the density of ordinary things. The way a room could hold his absence more powerfully than it had ever held his presence. They had built 42 years together. That was the number she kept returning to. Not a round number, not a milestone year, just the actual count of seasons they had moved through side by side. Rowan had built a trucking company from a single leased vehicle and a contract he'd cold called his way into at the age of 29. By the time he was 50, the company ran 41 trucks across 17 states. By 60, 48 trucks, regional contracts, a reputation for reliability that had taken decades to earn, and that Miriam had helped protect at every step. She had managed the books since the beginning, not as a courtesy, not as a hobby, as a full and equal partner in the financial architecture of everything they built. She knew the accounts the way she knew the rooms of their house, the way she knew Rowan's handwriting, the way she knew the sound of his step on the stairs. She had built the systems that kept the company honest. She had sat across from bankers and auditors and contract lawyers and held her ground in rooms where people had sometimes looked past her to find the person they assumed was really in charge. She knew this company. She had made this company. What she had not known and had not allowed herself to fully consider in the 23 days since Rowan died was whether the company knew her. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a downtown building with views of the river. Gerald Harmon had been Rowan's lawyer for over a decade, a careful, methodical man who communicated primarily in qualifications and whose silences tended to carry more information than his sentences. Miriam arrived 8 minutes early and sat in the reception area with her folder on her lap and her hands folded on top of it. Renata arrived 12 minutes late. She always arrived late to things. Miriam had observed this over the years, without comment, the way Renata used lateness as a kind of statement, a small, daily assertion that her time was more valuable than whoever was waiting for it. Today she came through the glass doors in an outfit that had clearly been chosen with the occasion in mind. Not morning clothes, not exactly, but something in deep charcoal and cream that managed to suggest grief while simultaneously announcing wealth. Her hair was perfect. Her heels were significant. She smiled when she saw Miriam. It was the smile Miriam had always found most difficult to read. Broad, warm, the smile of a woman who had practiced warmth until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. After Beckett died 15 years ago, Renata had stayed. That was the thing Rowan had never gotten past. He lost his son and kept his daughter-in-law, and in his grief, he had apparently decided that Renata's continued presence was a form of loyalty to Beckett's memory. Miriam had never been able to agree, but she had never been able to prove the alternative. Miriam, Renata said, bending to offer the kind of embrace that communicates affection without actually providing it. You look exhausted. Are you sleeping? Fine, Miriam said. They went in. Gerald Harmon cleared his throat 3 times before he began reading. Miriam noticed this. She filed it alongside the other observations she was making. The way he didn't meet her eyes when she first sat down, the way his hands moved through the folder with slightly more deliberateness than was necessary, the way the junior associate in the corner of the room seemed to be studying the middle distance with unusual intensity. The company went to Renata, the full trucking operation, vehicles, contracts, facilities, accounts, receivable, the name Callaway Freight that Rowan had built from nothing. The house went to Renata, The home Miriam had lived in for 31 years, where she had planted the garden in the back and chosen the paint colors for every room, and where Rowan had died 3 weeks ago in his study on a Tuesday morning. The investment accounts, the savings, the personal property, the vehicles, all to Renata. Miriam sat with her hands folded and her face arranged in an expression that gave nothing away. She had learned the complete composure of a woman who has spent 4 decades in rooms where showing weakness was not an option. Her breathing was steady. Her hands did not move. Harmon cleared his throat a fourth time. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "there is one more item." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a deed, 5 acres of forested land, 40 miles outside the city, in a key. Old rusted, attached to a small cardboard tag with string. On the tag, in Rowan's handwriting, Station 1926. "What is that?" Renata asked. She had leaned forward slightly to look. "It's a property," Harmon said. 5 acres of forest land. There's a structure on it, an old gas station, built in 1926. It's been in the Calloway family since it was constructed. The road that used to pass it was rerouted decades ago, so there's no through traffic. The structure is standing." Renata looked at the deed, then at Miriam, and then she laughed. It was a genuine laugh. That was the thing about it. It wasn't performed cruelty, wasn't calculated. It was the spontaneous, unguarded laugh of someone who has encountered something so absurd that the social filters simply failed to engage in time. A gas station in the middle of nowhere. An abandoned structure on land that went nowhere, connected to nothing worth what? Exactly the sentimental value of a building that hadn't pumped fuel in half a century. "A gas station," Renata said when she recovered herself. "Rowan left you a gas station in the middle of a forest." She turned to Miriam fully, and her expression had settled into something that was almost sympathetic, a soft, pitying look of someone who believes they are witnessing the final confirmation of a conclusion they reached long ago. "He always was practical," she said. "In his way." Miriam looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the folder. She picked up the rusted key. She stood, nodded once to Gerald Harmon, and walked out of the office without speaking. Behind her, she heard Renata begin talking to the attorney in the bright, efficient tone of someone moving on to the next thing, the important things, the real business of the morning. Miriam walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with the folder against her chest and the key in her right hand and said nothing to no one until the doors opened and she stepped inside. The parking garage was cool and smelled of concrete and exhaust. She sat in her car for 11 minutes. She did not cry. She had not cried in Harmon's office, and she would not cry here in a parking garage, in a car that still had Rowan's reading glasses in the center console and a receipt from his last gas stop folded in the cup holder. She had moved through the last 23 days in a state of careful, functional grief, doing what needed doing, making the calls that needed making, sleeping badly, but sleeping, and she was not going to stop now. But she sat there for 11 minutes because she needed to think clearly before she moved, and thinking clearly required stillness. She opened the folder. Beneath the deed, beneath the property description with its legal coordinates and tax parcel numbers, was a piece of paper she hadn't noticed before. Not an official document, a personal letter handwritten on plain stationery in Rowan's deliberate, slightly backward, slanting script. The date at the top was 3 weeks before he died. "My dearest Miriam, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive. I tried to find the right moment for years and never found it, which tells you something about my failures as a man and nothing about my intentions as a husband. The station isn't what it seems. It never was. My grandfather built it for reasons that had nothing to do with selling gasoline, and what he put there, what I have kept there, what you will find there, belongs to you now in every way that matters. Trust your instincts. Trust what we built together. The answer is in the silence. All my love, Rowan." She read it 3 times. The answer is in the silence. She knew his handwriting the way she knew his voice. She knew the way he constructed a sentence, the way he built toward the thing he meant, rather than stating it directly, the way his written words always had more care in them than his spoken ones, because he had more time to arrange them. This letter was not the apology of a man who had done her wrong. It was the message of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally found a way to put it down. He had left her a message. He had left her something Renata couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't take. Miriam folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. She put the folder on the passenger seat. She placed the rusted key on top of it where she could see it, and she started her car. 40 miles was nothing. She had driven further for less. The roads changed as she went. Highway first 4 lanes and smoothed the city, giving way to suburb and then to the particular nowhere land of commercial sprawl, strip malls and storage facilities and car dealerships. And then that fell away too, and it was county routes 2 lanes, the landscape opening up into fields and stands of second-growth timber and farmhouses set back from the road at the end of long gravel drives. Then the county route became a gravel road. The gravel road became a dirt track, and the dirt track disappeared into forest. She followed it. The trees here were old in a way that the second-growth stands weren't massive, their canopies closing overhead and reducing the afternoon light to something green and filtered and cathedral quiet. The track was still passable, just barely, her sedan moving slowly over roots and ruts, while branches occasionally brushed the mirrors. The forest felt like a different country, dense and still and holding its own time separate from the one she'd left behind in the attorney's office 2 hours earlier. Then she saw it. The station came out of the mist, the way certain things come out of mist gradually, and then all at once the shape revolving from the gray-green background in stages until suddenly it was simply there, complete and present and waiting. Miriam stopped the car. She sat in and looked at it through the windshield for a full minute before she got out. The building was 1926 in every detail, Art Deco structure, white stucco walls now greened with moss and wrapped in climbing vines, but the bones intact beneath it. 2 vintage gas pumps stood under a curved canopy supported by slender pillars whose lines were still clean, despite a century of weather. The main building had large windows, dusty but unbroken, and a door painted deep red that had faded over the decades to something closer to rust brown. Above the door, a painted sign, Callaway Station Ascend, 1926. The clearing around the station was circular. Not roughly circular, precisely almost geometrically circular, as if the forest had been asked to give way in a particular radius and had agreed to the exact terms requested. Wildflowers grew in the cracks of the old concrete apron. Birds moved through the surrounding trees. Miriam got out of the car slowly. The first thing she noticed before she reached the door, before she tried the key, the first thing was the silence. Not the absence of sound, because there were sounds, the birds, the wind in the high branches, the distant settling of the old building. But beneath all of that, a quality of quiet that was different from ordinary quiet, deeper, more intentional. The silence of a place that had been keeping something to itself for a very long time. She approached the door and tried the rusted key. It took effort, the lock resisting with the stubbornness of decades before finally giving way. And the door opened with a sound that echoed off the trees and was swallowed immediately by the surrounding forest. Inside the station was exactly what it appeared to be, and exactly not what it appeared to be. A wooden counter ran the length of one wall, beautiful carved oak, now covered in dust, but structurally intact, the work of someone who had known what they were doing with wood. Shelves that had once held supplies stood empty but unbroken. A cast-iron pot-bellied stove sat in one corner. The floor was wide plank hardwood, solid under her feet in a way that surprised her, solid and unwarped, as if the building's foundations had decided years ago that they were not going to participate in the usual deterioration. And everywhere that silence, profound, almost sacred. Miriam stood in the center of the room and simply breathed for a moment. Rowan's grandfather had built this. She had heard references to it over the years. The old station, the family property, the land out in the forest, but it had always been background context, a detail mentioned in passing, infiled without particular significance. Jasper Callaway had built a gas station in 1926. The highway had rerouted. The station had become obsolete almost immediately. A curiosity. A white elephant. Except Rowan's note suggested something else entirely. She moved to the counter and examined the shelves behind it. Old ledgers, their pages yellowed to the color of old ivory, but the bindings intact. She opened the nearest one, carefully turning pages with the deliberateness of someone who understands that old things deserve consideration. Entries through the 1930s, fuel quantities, supply, cost, maintenance records. Ordinary accounting and the kind she had spent a career producing and reading. She was about to set it down when she saw it. In the margin of a page dated 1934, drawn in pencil, with the small, precise hand of someone who sketched automatically while thinking a diagram. The two gas pumps as seen from above with arrows pointing downward from each base and a single word written in script so small she had to bring the ledger close to read it. Ventilation. She set the ledger down and went outside. The pumps were beautiful. Standing before them, she could see why collectors would want them, vintage Art Deco design the same period as the building. The proportions elegant in a way that later design had abandoned in favor of utility. The display windows that should have shown gallons pumped were intact but dark, and when Miriam leaned close and looked through the dusty glass, she stopped breathing for a moment. Not numbers, not any kind of fuel measurement, compass markings, coordinates. Small, precise engraved into the mechanism behind the glass, not painted on, not added later, but built in from the beginning. The north indicator, the degree markings, a set of numbers in a format she recognized immediately from 40 years of logistics work as geographic coordinates. These pumps had never been designed to measure fuel. They were designed to mark a location. Miriam stepped back and looked at the clearing with new eyes. The perfect circular shape. The road that ended here that didn't connect to anything, that didn't lead anywhere beyond this point. A gas station that was not on the way to anywhere, that served no passing traffic, that had been built in an isolated forest clearing on land that Jasper Calloway had chosen with apparent deliberateness. This wasn't a failed business venture. This was a marker, a landmark built to indicate a specific place on the surface of the earth. She went back inside. She moved more slowly this time, running her hands over surfaces, paying the kind of attention she paid to financial documents when she suspected something was present that wasn't immediately visible. The walls, the floor, the counter. She examined the counter more carefully, pressing against it, testing it, feeling the wood with her palms. And there on the side panel, facing away from the door, hidden from anyone who entered the station and looked toward the front, a carved symbol. Small, deeply cut into the oak, worn smooth at the edges by the same decades that had worn everything else, but still precise in its form. A geometric shape, angular and deliberate. Miriam went still. She looked at her left hand, the ring Rowan had given her on their 10th anniversary. My grandfather's mark, he had said when he gave it, for things that matter, had that symbol on the interior band. She had worn it for 32 years and known it as a family emblem without ever asking more about it. She pressed the symbol on the counter. Nothing happened. She tried turning her ring against it the way you might turn a key. Nothing. She stood in the station and thought. The answer is in the silence. What was silence? What created it? What lived inside it? She stood perfectly still and let the question work through her, the way she let difficult problems work through her, not forcing it, not pressing, just allowing the available information to arrange itself into a shape. Her eyes moved to the pot-bellied stove in the corner. She crossed the room and crouched before it, opening the iron door. No ash, no residue of old fires. Instead, pushed into the back of the firebox, carefully positioned, away from the opening, a small metal box wrapped in oilcloth. She recognized the wrapping immediately, the same kind of oilcloth Rowan kept in his workshop for protecting tools from moisture. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a key. Brass newer than the station key, its metal still showing the slight shine of something that had been handled in living memory. Attached to it with a thin wire, a small tag. On the tag, a single character 1. Miriam held the key in her palm for a moment. Pump number 1. She went back outside. The afternoon light was lower now, the forest shadows lengthening across the clearing. She walked to the first pump and crouched at its base, running her hands over the concrete housing. Decades of grime and weathering. She pressed her palm flat and moved it slowly over the surface, feeling for variation in texture. There a seam, and within the seam a panel perhaps 4 inches square, nearly invisible under the accumulated weathering. She cleaned it with the hem of her jacket, revealing a face of smooth brass. In the center of the brass panel, a keyhole. The brass key fit with the precision of something engineered to fit, no wiggling, no hesitation, the teeth of the key finding their channels cleanly. She turned it. The sound that came from beneath the ground made her stand up involuntarily and step backward. Not the gurgle of old fuel lines, not any sound that belonged to a gas station. A deep mechanical sound, the sound of something large and precisely engineered, waking after a very long sleep. Gears engaging, mechanisms moving. The concrete apron around the pumps trembled slightly, a fine vibration that traveled up through the soles of her shoes and into her legs and then stopped. Everything went still again. Miriam stood in the clearing with the late afternoon light falling around her and the forest watching from all sides, and she waited. Nothing else happened. Whatever the key had activated, it had begun something without completing it. She was missing a step. She went back inside. She stood behind the counter and looked at the carved symbol and thought about mechanisms and sequences and the way her husband's grandfather had built something in 1924 that was still intact and still functional 100 years later, which meant he had built it with engineering that understood time, that accounted for time, that was designed to outlast the impatience of any single generation. This wasn't a single step. It was a sequence. She pressed the symbol again, this time with her full palm rather than just her fingers, and pushed. The counter moved, not dramatically, a fraction of an inch at first, and then more as she maintained the pressure, the whole unit sliding backward on what must have been rails hidden beneath the floor. The top panel, she realized, was hinged. As the counter slid backward, the hinged section lifted, and beneath it, revealed in the gap between the floor and the lifted panel, was something she had not expected. A control panel. Brass switches and dials set into a housing of dark-stained wood, each component labeled with small engraved plates. She read them in sequence: Pump 1, Pump 2, Canopy, Office, Archive. This was a system, not improvised, not added later. Engineered from the beginnings as part of the structure built into the architecture of a building that everyone had dismissed for a century as a failed roadside business. Miriam's hands were steady. They were always steady. She read the labels again. She thought about the mechanical sound from beneath the ground when she turned the pump key. The system had been primed. The key at pump 1 had activated something, started a sequence. What she was looking at now was the continuation of that sequence. She reached out and flipped the switch labeled Office. The floor moved. The section of hardwood beneath and in front of the counter shifted, not the grinding protest of old machinery, but a smooth, nearly silent withdrawal, the board sliding aside on a mechanism that had been engineered for exactly this motion. The gap widened, revealing an opening in the floor approximately 4 feet wide. And from that opening, steps. Not rough wooden steps dug into earthen walls. Marble. Pale gray marble, each step perfectly proportioned, the edges squared and true, the surface polished so smooth that even under a century of disuse, it caught and reflected the light from the station above. And that light, it was not just the light filtering down from the station windows. From somewhere below, from the depth of whatever space those stairs descended into, a warm amber glow rose steadily upward, as if something beneath the forest floor had been waiting for exactly this moment to illuminate itself. Miriam stood at the edge of the opening. The air that came up from below was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent she recognized immediately. Cedar and old paper, the smell of things carefully preserved, of objects that had been protected from the ordinary processes of decay with intention and skill. She looked at the steps. She looked at the amber light rising from below. She looked at the key still in her hand. She thought about Rowan writing his letter in his study 3 weeks before he died, choosing his words with the care he always brought to written things. The station isn't what it seems. Trust your instincts. She gripped the brass railing, cool and solid, the metal unchanged by a century, and she began to descend. The steps went down farther than she expected. She counted them. 10, 20, 30. The station above receded and the amber light below grew stronger, warmer, more present. The air cooled with each step, settling into the even, stable temperature of deep earth. Not cold, just consistent, the temperature of a place that the seasons had never reached. 40 steps. 50. The walls of the shaft were stone, cut stone, fitted with the same precision as everything else. The seams tight and level, and dressed to a smoothness that spoke of serious craft. This had not been dug by hand with simple tools. This had been engineered. 60 steps. The stairway opened. Miriam stopped at the bottom step, her hands still on the railing, and looked at what Rowan's grandfather had built beneath a forest in 1924, what Rowan had maintained and protected and finally given to her with a rusted key and a handwritten note. The chamber was vast. That was the first word her mind produced, and it was inadequate, but it was the beginning. Vast, extending perhaps 60 feet in length, 40 in width, the ceiling rising 15 feet overhead in coffered panels of dark wood alternating with decorative plasterwork that belonged in a different century in a different continent. From the center of that ceiling hung a chandelier, its crystals catching and fracturing the amber light from the electric bulbs it held, throwing patterns of refracted light across the floor and walls in a constant, gentle movement. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with cabinets. Mahogany glass fronted each cabinet, fronted with small brass plaques bearing dates and catalog numbers. The floor was polished stone, the same gray marble as the stairs, laid in precise rectangles so perfectly finished that she could see a distorted reflection of herself standing at the base of the stairs. Running down the center of the chamber, dividing the space like an aisle, were glass display cases mounted on wooden pedestals. Each case was lit from within by small bulbs that threw a focused light on whatever was inside. Miriam walked forward slowly, her footsteps producing a soft rhythmic echo off the stone floor that seemed to move through the chamber like a pulse. She approached the nearest display case. She looked at what it held. Jewelry. Not costume pieces, not decorative objects, jewelry of a quality and period that she recognized immediately as something removed from the ordinary world of commerce and into the category of art. A diamond necklace, 3 strands of perfectly matched stones, each diamond the size of her thumbnail lying on deep blue velvet, with the careless beauty of something that had always known its own worth. An emerald bracelet, the stones so saturated with color they seemed to emit their own light. A ruby brooch shaped like a phoenix in flight. Each piece rested on its velvet, and beside each piece was a small card handwritten in a precise formal script. She leaned close and read the nearest card. Property of Helena Rothschild, Vienna. Deposited March 15, 1938. Miriam straightened slowly. 1938. March 1938. Austria. The Anschluss, the German annexation, had occurred in March of 1938. Helena Rothschild had brought her family's jewelry to this vault beneath a forest in America in the same month that her country ceased to exist as a sovereign state. She had brought it here to this impossible place in this isolated forest, and she had left it with Jasper Calloway and his covenant and his silence, and she had gone. The next case held a different collection labeled with the same formal precision. Property of the Whitmore family, London, deposited September 12, 1940. The Blitz had begun in September 1940. Case after case, cabinet after cabinet, each one a name, a city, a date, a story compressed into the bureaucratic language of a receipt. Amsterdam 1941, Warsaw 1942, Budapest 1944. The war, always the war, moving across the continent and driving people across oceans, carrying what they could, trusting it to strangers. Trusting it to Jasper Calloway, who had built a vault beneath a forest and told no one and kept everything. Miriam walked to the far end of the chamber, past the display cases, past the mahogany cabinets, with their brass plaques, to the desk that sat against the rear wall. On the desk was a leather journal, thick and dark, its cover worn to the texture of something that had been handled regularly over many years. She sat down in the chair. She opened the journal. The handwriting was not Rowan's. Older, more formal, the pen strokes of a man who had learned to write in the 19th century and never lost the habits of that education. She read the first entry, dated 1924. I have built the repository. The station above is merely the entrance. What lies below is a promise, a place of safety for those who must flee, who must hide what they cannot carry. We will keep their treasures until they return. And if they do not return, the items will remain held in trust until the law allows their transfer to the keeper of this place. My family will maintain this trust for as long as it takes. This is our covenant. This is our silence. She turned pages. Jasper's entries through the 20s and 30s, the network he had built, the people he had worked with, the system by which desperate men and women had found their way to this forest clearing and descended these marble stairs with their last irreplaceable things. He wrote about them with the same matter-of-fact precision he brought to everything, not sentimentally, not dramatically, but with the absolute seriousness of a man who understood that what he was holding had cost everything to bring here. She found Rowan's entries near the back of the journal, his handwriting familiar and present, written in the same backward slant as his letter to her. The last entry was dated 6 months before he died. The 100 years have passed for most deposits. I have maintained this place as my grandfather wished. The covenant holds. Miriam, if you are reading this, know that everything here is now legally and entirely yours. Ons. More importantly, know that I trusted you with this because you understand what matters. The value isn't in the objects, it's in the keeping of faith. Do with this what your conscience tells you. I love you. I trust you. Always. She sat in the chair at the desk at the far end of the vault and held the journal in both hands and let the weight of it settle through her. Rowan had not left her a gas station. He had not left her an insult or a consolation prize or a remnant. He had left her the thing he trusted most completely, the covenant his grandfather had made with frightened people a century ago. See, the promise that what was left here would be kept, that this place would endure, that someone would be responsible for it when he no longer could be. He had left her the thing he could not tell Renata. He had left her the thing that Renata, with all her charcoal and cream and careful smiling, could not have understood if she'd been standing in this room with the journal in her hands. Miriam sat in the amber light of a vault that had kept faith with the dead for 100 years, and she understood something she had not understood when she walked into Gerald Harmon's office that morning. The will had not insulted her. The will had told her exactly what her husband thought of her in the clearest possible terms, in the only language that had ever really mattered between them. He had given her the hardest thing, the most important thing, the thing that required everything she actually was. She stood up. She walked back through the vault, past the cases and the cabinets and the chandelier and the reflected light moving slowly across the marble floor. She climbed the marble stairs. She came up into the station, into the late afternoon light that fell through the dusty windows in long amber angles. She stood behind the counter and breathed. Then she looked around the station, the stove, the shelves, the beautiful old oak counter, and began quietly and with what ceremony to take inventory. There was a great deal of work to do, and she had, for the first time in 23 days, something that felt like a clear sense of what. She slept in her car that first night. Not because she had to, she had a hotel room booked in the city 40 miles and a lifetime away, but because she wasn't ready to leave. That was the honest reason, and Miriam had spent too many decades being honest with herself to dress it up in something more practical. She reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, pulled her jacket across her shoulders, and listened to the forest settle into darkness around the station. The trees here had their own nighttime vocabulary. Sounds she couldn't identify, the movement of animals through undergrowth, the distant call of something she couldn't name, the occasional crack of a branch in the canopy high above. Different from city silence, different from the silence of her house in the weeks since Rowan died. This silence had mass to it. Presence, the silence of a place that had been keeping its own counsel for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. She thought about Jasper Calloway building this. Not the mechanics of it, she had already begun working through the engineering questions, the logistics of how you excavate 60 feet of marble staircase beneath a forest without anyone knowing the resources that required the network of people and silence and deliberate invisibility that would have to surround a project of that scope. Those questions would have their answers in time. What she thought about now was the intention. The choice, a man in 1924 deciding to build something that he knew he would never see the full purpose of. Something designed to outlast not just himself, but his children, and possibly his grandchildren, built on the premise that the world would continue to produce people who needed exactly what this place offered. He had been right. The world had not disappointed him on that point. She woke before dawn, stiff and cold, and more rested than she had any right to expect. She drove to a gas station 20 miles back on the county road, bought coffee and a sandwich that tasted of refrigeration and regret, and drove back to the clearing as the sky lightened through the trees. She had decided somewhere in the dark between sleeping and waking, going to rush this. She was going to be methodical. She was going to be exactly who she had always been in the context of the most extraordinary thing she had ever been handed, and she was going to do it right. The first thing she did when she unlocked the station and went back down into the vault in the early morning light was red, not skim red. She sat at the desk with Jasper's journal and Rowan's entries and a legal pad she'd found in her car, and she worked through everything with the same focused attention she brought to financial documents that needed to be fully understood before any decisions were made. Jasper had been meticulous. His records were organized chronologically, each deposit entered with a name, a date, a description of items, and a receipt number that corresponded to a tag system she found in the cabinet drawers, small brass tags numbered attached to each item with fine wire. He had cross-referenced everything. He had maintained a ledger of depositors in addition to the journal, and the ledger was organized by year and country of origin, the entries written in the formal script of a man for whom record-keeping was a moral act. She counted the deposits. 47 distinct families or individuals from 11 countries over a period running from 1933 to 1945. The earliest deposits were from Germany families reading the direction of things clearly enough to act early. The later deposits had a different character, more urgent, the items more varied, the descriptions sometimes less precise, as if the depositor had been moving too fast to inventory carefully. They had all trusted Jasper Calloway. They had all found their way to this forest clearing in the middle of America and descended these stairs and handed over what they valued most and accepted a brass-tagged receipt and left. 31 of the 47 had no return record. No claim, no correspondence, no indication that anyone had ever come back. Jasper had noted this in his journal with the same measured precision he brought to everything else depositor not returned. Items remain in trust, status preserved, 31 families. 31 collections of things that had survived because someone built a room to hold them. She found Rowan's maintenance logs in a separate folder, quarterly inspections of the vault systems, annual reviews of the climate control machinery records of items he had confirmed were still in good condition. He had been doing this since his father handed the responsibility to him in 1987. 28 years of quiet maintenance of coming to this forest clearing and descending these stairs and checking that everything was still intact, still preserved, still waiting. He had never told her. She turned that over slowly. She understood why not immediately, not as a simple thing, but she worked through it the way she worked through complex accounts, tracing the logic of it. He had been protecting the covenant by maintaining its secrecy, not because he didn't trust Miriam, but because the fewer people who knew, the more certain the protection was. He had been waiting for the right moment to bring her in. He had run out of time before he found it, and so he had left her the key and the silence, and the message, trust your instincts. She sat with that for a moment in the amber light. Then she picked up her legal pad and began making a list. The list was long. First, legal verification. She needed to confirm her ownership of the vault contents under the property custodianship laws Jasper had referenced in his journal. She needed a lawyer, not Harmon, who was Rowan's man, and perhaps not entirely uncompromised by his relationship with Renata, but someone she had researched and chosen herself. Second, full inventory and appraisal. Every item in the vault needed to be documented, photographed, assessed for condition and value. This was months of work minimum, probably longer. Third, provenance research. For every deposit, she needed to understand the current legal status of the depositor's family, whether heirs existed, whether claims could be made, whether items should be returned, or were genuinely orphaned by time and the violence of the century. Fourth, the vault's physical systems. The climate control, the electrical, whatever power source had maintained perfect conditions for 100 years. She needed to understand it, verify it, ensure it would continue. She wrote all of this in her clear, even handwriting and reviewed it with the satisfaction she always took in a problem that had been accurately sized. Large, complicated, serious, but solvable. All of it solvable with time and attention and the particular skills she had spent 42 years developing. She closed the journal, stood, and climbed back up into the station. The morning light through the dusty windows showed her the space differently than the afternoon had, cleaner, more detailed, the bones of the architecture more visible. The station was genuinely beautiful. The stucco work, the Art Deco proportions, the oak counter, with its carved details, someone had built this with love for what they were building, not just as cover for what lay below, but as a thing worth building in itself. She drove back to the city and found a new attorney by end of day. His name was Fletcher Norris, 55 years old, a practice that specialized in estate law and property custodianship with a secondary focus on international property repatriation, which was, she thought, reading his firm's description, exactly the combination she needed. She called his office at 4 in the afternoon and had an appointment for 9 the next morning. Fletcher Norris turned out to be a compact, careful man with the habit of listening completely before he said anything, which Miriam recognized immediately as the sign of someone whose intelligence was practical rather than performative. She gave him the full situation in 40 minutes: the will, the property, the vault, Jasper's covenant, the 47 deposits, the legal question of ownership. She put the relevant documents on his desk as she spoke. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, then said, "The custodianship laws from that period are obscure but real. Your husband was correct about the 100-year provision. Combined with the property deed and the documented chain of family maintenance, your ownership of the unclaimed items is defensible and likely absolute. I'll need 2 weeks to confirm the specifics." "Take what you need," Miriam said. "But be thorough." "But I'm always thorough," he said without any particular emphasis, which she found reassuring. She drove back to the forest that afternoon. The weeks that followed had a shape she recognized from the best periods of her working life, the shape of serious work undertaken with clear purpose. She established a routine: 3 days a week at the vault, 2 days managing the legal and logistical work, from the city weekends, reviewing what she'd learned and planning the next phase. She worked through the vault methodically, cabinet by cabinet, case by case. She photographed everything with a camera she bought specifically for this purpose, a professional-grade body with macro capabilities for capturing the detail of small items. She cross-referenced Jasper's records against the physical inventory, noting discrepancies, flagging items whose condition differed from the original description. The vault had maintained itself with extraordinary fidelity. The climate control system, which turned out to be a cleverly engineered passive system, supplemented by a small electrical unit that ran on solar panels concealed on the station's roof, had kept temperature and humidity within ranges that professional conservators would have approved of. Jasper had understood preservation in a way that went beyond his era's general knowledge, had built-in redundancies that had ensured the system's continuity across a century of unmanned operation. She found in one of the upper cabinets a collection of documents. She had not initially cataloged financial records, meticulously organized in a separate folder, marked in Rowan's handwriting, "Callaway Family Trust, Private Records." She opened it. It took her approximately 40 minutes to understand what she was reading. She sat very still for those 40 minutes, turning pages, cross-referencing figures following the paper trail, with the forensic attention of someone who had spent 4 decades as the person most qualified in any room to understand what financial records actually said. When she reached the end of the folder, she set it down on the desk and sat with her hands flat on the surface of it and looked at the wall of the vault. Renata had been stealing from the company for 7 years, not carelessly, systematically, with the kind of patient deliberateness that suggested either professional advice or a natural aptitude for financial crime. Asset sales documented as operational losses, transfers to accounts with names that differed from Renata's by a single character in a filing system that had become large enough that no one would catch it without specifically looking. Contracts with shell vendors that existed on paper and invoiced regularly and delivered nothing. And at the end, the detail that made Miriam's blood go cold and still. At the same time, documents bearing Rowan's signature dated after his death, authorizing transfers that had continued in the weeks following his heart attack. He hadn't known. She was certain of that, reading the records, reading the dates, reading the trajectory. Rowan had trusted Renata because she was Beckett's widow, because grief had fused them in a way that made criticism feel like betrayal, and he had not seen what was happening in the accounts, because Miriam had always been the one who saw what was happening in the accounts, and Renata had been careful to keep those particular records away from Miriam's line of sight. The company Renata had inherited, the company that represented the whole of Rowan's professional legacy, was largely hollow. The 48 trucks were encumbered with debt that had been manufactured to make the assets look less valuable. The contracts were in various states of compromise. The accounts that looked healthy on the surface had been systematically drained. Miriam sat in the vault for a long time after she finished reading. She did not rage. She recognized a person who raged. She was a person who went cold and clear when something important required her full and undivided attention. What she felt sitting in that amber-lit room with the evidence of Renata's theft spread across the desk was not anger in the hot sense, but something more like the absolute focused attention of a woman who has just understood the full dimensions of a problem and is preparing to solve it. She gathered the documents carefully and returned them to the folder. She went back upstairs. She locked the station. She drove to the city and called Fletcher Norris and told him she needed to add something to the scope of his work. He listened. He said he would look at it carefully. He said it was thorough. She said she knew. 3 months passed. They passed with the particular texture of months that are full of serious work, not quickly, not slowly, but with the dense, satisfying weight of time used well. Fletcher confirmed her ownership of the vault contents with a legal opinion that ran to 43 pages, in which she read in full. She hired 3 specialists, a conservator, an appraiser with European provenance experience, and a researcher who worked in Holocaust-era property restitution, and set them to work on the vault inventory with careful instructions about discretion. She sold the first piece in the 6th week, a diamond necklace, 3 strands of perfectly matched stones that had been deposited by a woman named Helena Rothschild in March of 1938. The provenance research had confirmed no living heirs. The Rothschild family who had owned this piece had been lost entirely, the name appearing in wartime records that ended without continuation. The necklace went through a private dealer to a collector who understood that some pieces carried history along with their carats. $340,000. She reinvested it carefully. The conservator identified 7 additional pieces whose ownership chains were similarly complete, no living heirs, no possibility of return, and the appraiser confirmed their current market values. By the end of the 3rd month, Miriam had liquidated assets totaling just under $2 million, leaving the vast majority of the vault's contents absolutely untouched. She lived from it simply. She had found a small apartment in a building she liked in a neighborhood she found manageable. She drove the same sedan. She ate at the same level she always had. She did not buy things. She was not storing up for comfort, she was storing up for purpose, and the purpose was not yet fully formed, but was taking shape the way a structure takes shape when the foundation has been properly laid. She also upgraded the station. Not dramatically, not in a way that called attention. She was not interested in calling attention. She had the roof and walls properly sealed against water, brought the electrical systems to code, repaired the floors and windows, and restored the red door to something closer to its original color. She installed modern security camera sensors, a monitored alarm system behind period-appropriate fixtures that preserved the station's visual character. She furnished a small apartment in the back room simply but well. She was making it livable. She was making it hers. The vintage pumps she restored to pristine condition, cleaned and treated and polished until they stood in the clearing like what they were: beautiful objects, precision instruments, century-old markers of something that existed beneath them. She understood them now, understood their design and their purpose, and that understanding made them more beautiful rather than less. They were not what they had appeared to be. Most important things weren't. She was at the station one morning in late September, sitting at the counter reviewing documents, when her phone showed a notification from the security system she had installed at what was technically still her house. The house Rowan had left to Renata, where she had packed her things and moved out 6 weeks earlier without making any particular event of it. The notification was a movement alert from the Property Records Office, cross-referenced to her estate. Automatic flag: her new attorney had set up monitoring for any legal or financial actions touching the properties associated with the estate. The county assessor had revalued her 5 acres of forest land. Overnight, the assessed value had increased by a factor of 20. She set her coffee down carefully. She pulled up the property records and read them with the same attention she brought to everything that needed to be understood before she responded to it. The revaluation was aggressive and poorly justified, the kind of assessment that happened when someone with influence made a call, rather than when a genuine market analysis had been conducted. She searched the assessor's recent records for comparable actions. She found 2 other properties that had received similar treatment in the past 18 months. Both had been acquired by the same purchaser within 6 months of the assessment, a development company with a registered address in Delaware. She searched the Delaware company's registered agent. She found the holding company above it. She found the holding company above that. At the top, an LLC registered in Nevada 18 months ago. Its operating manager listed as a name she had never seen before, but whose address matched exactly the address of the executive suite at Callaway Freight. Renata. The second action arrived 2 weeks later. An environmental preservation group she had never heard of filed a petition with the state to have her 5 acres declared a protected natural preserve, a designation that, if granted, would require the property owner to either donate the land to the state or face restrictions so severe as to make private ownership effectively impossible. Fletcher found the group's donor records within 48 hours of her asking him to look. The largest single donor, a contribution that represented nearly 60% of the group's total funding, came from the same Nevada LLC. Miriam sat with this information for an evening. She made tea. She sat by the restored window of the station apartment and looked out at the clearing in the October dark, the vintage pumps standing in the faint moonlight like sentinels, and she thought about what Renata understood and what she didn't. Renata understood that something was different. She had seen the revaluation of property that she had dismissed as worthless, and the revaluation had told her that someone else saw value there, and that someone else was Miriam, and that meant she had miscalculated. She didn't know about the vault. If she had known, the approach would have been far more direct, far more aggressive. She was operating on instinct and avarice, pressing in the direction of something she sensed without being able to name. She was trying to take the land before Miriam could benefit from it. Miriam thought about this carefully, the way she thought about everything that required a response. Not the immediate response, which was the one the situation seemed to demand, but the correct response, which was something else entirely. She called Fletcher in the morning. "I know," he said before she had finished describing what she had found. "I've been tracking it. She's moving on two fronts simultaneously. The tax assessment creates financial pressure. The environmental petition is the endgame. If it goes through, she acquires the land through the state process at depressed value. Can she succeed? Not if we're prepared. The assessment is challengeable on the evidence. The environmental group's petition has procedural vulnerabilities, but she'll keep escalating." "I know she will," Miriam said. "Let her." A pause. "You have something in mind." "I have several things in mind," Miriam said. "I need you to prepare documentation in 3 sets. I'll explain the specifics when I see you." She hung up and looked out at the clearing. She had spent 42 years learning how to wait for the right moment to be exactly right before acting. She had learned it from balance sheets and contract negotiations and the slow, patient work of building something that lasted. She was not going to act hastily now. When the stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the position she held was stronger than Renata imagined. She would wait. She would let Renata come to her. And when Renata arrived at this station, in this clearing, expecting to find a woman diminished by loss and age and isolation, she would find something else. She would find Miriam Calloway, who had spent 42 years being the most important person in every room she'd worked in without anyone in those rooms quite realizing it, who had been given by a husband who knew exactly what he was doing, the most important thing he had ever kept, who was ready. That work was. She heard Renata's car before she saw it. The sound of an expensive engine struggling over the dirt track carried through the forest with surprising clarity, the particular strain of a vehicle engineered for smooth surfaces being asked to negotiate something it was never designed for. Miriam had been sitting by the restored window for 20 minutes by then, her book open in her lap, her tea cooling on the small table beside her. She had known this morning would come. She had been preparing for it since the first tax assessment notice arrived, and she had continued preparing through everything that followed. And now it was here, and she felt nothing that resembled urgency. She set her book down, marking her place. Through the mist that had settled into the clearing in the early hours and not yet burned off, she watched Renata's white luxury SUV emerge from the tree line, with its paint already mud-splattered, and its undercarriage audibly scraping on roots it had no business encountering. The vehicle parked at an angle that suggested its driver had not fully committed to being here, as if leaving quickly might still be an option that needed to remain available. Miriam did not move from her chair. She had dressed this morning with the same care she brought to any meeting where the stakes were significant, which was to say with apparent simplicity that required considerable thought. The black dress was clean and well-cut, understated, in the way that expensive things sometimes manage to be understated. Her hair was back. Her posture was what it always was. At her throat, the necklace. 3 strands of perfectly matched diamonds, each stone the size of her thumbnail, the whole piece catching the pale October light that came through the restored windows and throwing small, prismatic patterns across the wall behind her. Helena Rothschild's necklace, which Miriam had sold through a private dealer for $340,000, and then in a move that had given her quiet satisfaction, purchased back from the buyer at the same price, because some pieces were not meant to sit in a collector's vault. They were meant to be worn. They were meant to be present in the world, visible, a testament to the fact that the person who wore them understood what they carried. Miriam understood exactly what she was carrying. Renata knocked on the red door 3 sharp proprietary knocks. the knock of someone who has decided they are entering, regardless of the answer, and then opened it without waiting. She came 3 steps inside and stopped. Miriam watched the calculation happen in real time across Renata's face. The station interior had been transformed from the abandoned structure Renata had laughed about in the attorney's office 8 months earlier. The wood floor gleamed under careful restoration. The oak counter was polished to a warmth that brought out the quality of the original carving. The walls held art chosen with discretion, not ostentatious, nothing that shouted wealth but pieces that quietly confirmed it. The furniture was comfortable and considered. The light fixtures, period appropriate but functional, filled the space with a warmth that the mist outside made more pronounced by contrast. And at the center of it all, Miriam in her chair with her book and her tea, and the necklace at her throat looking like a woman who had been exactly here for exactly this long and found it entirely sufficient. The speech Renata had prepared, whatever it was, whatever combination of concern and condescension she had assembled for the drive out, did not survive contact with what she was seeing. Miriam watched it disintegrate behind the younger woman's eyes, watched her reassemble something more cautious in its place. "Miriam," she said, "you look—" She stopped. "Well," Miriam said pleasantly, "thank you for noticing. Please sit." She gestured to the chair across from her without standing. The chair was slightly lower than hers, not dramatically, not manipulatively, just the natural result of the furniture arrangement, and Renata sat in it and spent a moment recalibrating. "The station looks different," Renata said. "I've made some improvements. It's a beautiful building, actually." The admission seemed to cost her something. "I didn't realize." "Most people don't," Miriam said. "It was always beautiful. It just needed someone to see it properly." Renata's eyes kept returning to the necklace with the helpless attention of someone trying not to stare at something and failing. "That's a remarkable piece." "It is." Miriam touched it lightly with 2 fingers. "It belonged to a woman named Helena Rothschild. She was from Vienna. She brought it here in 1938 because she needed somewhere safe to leave it." She paused. "She never came back." The sentence landed in the room and sat there. Renata looked at the necklace and then at Miriam, and something moved behind her eyes that might have been unease if she had been capable of it in its full form. How did I what?" Miriam asked gently. The question went unanswered. Renata shifted in her chair and arrived at the version of herself she had driven 40 miles to present. "I came because I've been concerned. Living out here alone at your age, it's not practical. I found a lovely facility in the city, very well regarded, a good community." "I'm 68, Renata," Miriam said. "Not 90, and I'm not alone. I'm exactly where I chose to be. But the land there are complications developing. The county assessment, the environmental questions. I don't want you to be caught in something difficult without support. The environmental group you're funding through a shell company registered in Nevada," Miriam said. The sentence came out at exactly the same conversational pitch as everything that had preceded it. That was important. She had practiced it, not the words but the tone, the complete absence of accusation or drama, the matter-of-fact delivery of a fact that was simply a fact. Renata went very still. "And the tax assessment that someone arranged through the county office." Miriam continued turning a page of her closed book with one hand, as if the gesture were entirely natural. "Yes, I'm aware of both. I've been aware since the first notices arrived." "I don't know what you think you're—" "Of course you do." Miriam set the book aside fully and gave Renata her complete attention, not aggressively, just completely, the way she gave complete attention to things that deserved it. "You want this land. You've been trying to force me off it through financial pressure and regulatory action. What I can't quite determine is whether you know what's here or whether you're simply operating on instinct." Renata's jaw tightened. "You're living in a shack in the middle of a forest, Miriam. I'm trying to—" "You're trying to take the last thing Rowan left me," Miriam said. Still the same tone, still perfectly level, the same way you've been taking things for 7 years. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. Renata said nothing. Her hands, Miriam noticed, had moved to her lap and pressed together there. "Would you like to see where Rowan kept his records?" Miriam asked. She stood without waiting for an answer. She moved behind the counter with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has performed a sequence many times and finds comfort in its familiarity. She pressed the carved symbol, Jasper's mark, the same mark on her wedding ring, the mark for things that matter, and lifted the hinged section of the counter. She revealed the brass control panel with its labeled switches and dials. She watched Renata's face as she looked at it, the confusion, the beginning of recalibration, the dawning sense that something was here that she had not accounted for. Miriam flipped the switch labeled office. The floor moved. Renata made a sound, not a word, just an involuntary exhalation, and stepped back. The hardwood slid aside in its smooth, silent withdrawal, revealing the opening, and from below, the amber light rose steadily upward, and the cool cedar and paper air drifted into the station like a message from underground. "Come," Miriam said. She took the brass railing and began to descend. Behind her, after a pause of several seconds, she heard Renata follow. The vault received them as it always received her now, with the amber light in the still air, in the particular silence of a place that had been keeping serious things for a long time. Miriam descended the last steps and stood on the marble floor and waited while Renata came down behind her and stopped at the base of the stairway and simply stared. She had seen this reaction before. She had experienced it herself standing at the bottom of these stairs 8 months ago with her hand on the railing and her breath gone shallow. The vault defied the ordinary categories the mind used to process underground spaces. It was too large, too beautiful, too deliberate, too complete. It looked like something that belonged in a European capital, not 60 feet below an abandoned gas station in a forest 40 miles from anywhere. Renata turned slowly, looking at the mahogany cabinets, the glass display cases, the chandelier throwing its fractured light across the polished marble floor. "What is this?" she said. Not a question. The grammar of it was wrong, for a question was the grammar of someone who has encountered something that has temporarily exceeded the processing capacity of their framework for reality. 100 years of kept promises, Miriam said. Rowan's grandfather built this in 1924. He built it as a covenant, a place where people who had to flee, who needed somewhere safe to leave what they couldn't carry, could trust that their things would be kept until they returned. She moved forward through the chamber toward the display cases in the center. Most of them never returned. The vault kept their treasures anyway. Renata followed slowly, her heels clicking against the marble with a sound that echoed softly through the chamber. She looked into the nearest display case, the jewelry on its blue velvet, the small handwritten cards with their names and dates and cities. Vienna, 1938. She read aloud from Helena Rothschild's card. "Just after the Anschluss," Miriam said. "She brought her family's jewelry here before she fled. She trusted strangers with the things she couldn't take." A pause. She didn't survive. Renata moved along the cases. Amsterdam, 1941. London, 1940. Warsaw, 1942. The dates and cities accumulated in the silence of the vault until they had their own weight, their own presence. The accumulated gravity of 47 families reduced to cards and brass tags, and the objects they had loved enough to carry across an ocean. Miriam let her look. She stood with her hands clasped behind her and let the vault make its own argument. Then she walked to the desk at the far end of the chamber. "Come here," she said. Renata came. She stood across the desk from Miriam and looked at the surface and the folders sitting on it, and her eyes moved to Miriam's face with something in them that was beginning to look like the early stages of understanding. Miriam opened the folder. "Every fraudulent transfer," she said, turning the first set of pages toward Renata. "Asset sales documented as operational losses. Payments to vendors that don't exist. Accounts in names that differ from yours by a single character. A clever touch, actually. It would have worked for much longer if Rowan hadn't kept his own parallel records down here separate from the company system you had access to." She turned to the next section. "And these are the documents bearing Rowan's signature, authorizing transfers that occurred after the 14th of March. She looked up. Rowan died on the 14th of March. These transfers were made on the 17th, the 22nd, and the 1st of April. Renata said nothing. The vault was very quiet around them. "Rowan trusted you," Miriam said. "Not because he was foolish, because you were Beckett's wife, and he couldn't separate his love for his son from his relationship with you, and you understood that and used it. For 7 years. She closed the folder. "The company you inherited is largely hollow. You knew that when you sat in Gerald Harmon's office and laughed. You already had the money. You were already looking for the next thing." Still nothing. "I want to understand one part," Miriam said. Did you arrange to keep the station out of your inheritance? Or was that Rowan's own doing? Renata looked up. He wouldn't tell me about it, she said finally. Her voice had changed. The warmth was entirely gone, the practiced surface stripped all away, leaving something harder and more honest underneath. He always said the station was family business, private. I pushed once, and he looked at me in a way I didn't like. A pause, so I stopped pushing. Miriam nodded slowly. He knew then, or suspected. I don't know what he knew. I do, Miriam said. He knew enough to put the records down here where you couldn't reach them. He knew enough to make sure the station came to me. Oh, she looked at the folder. He just didn't know enough in time. The silence that followed was long. Then Renata made her last move. Miriam had been expecting it. She knew Renata well enough by now to understand that she would not reach the end of her options without testing every one of them. You can't prosecute without going public, Renata said. Her voice had recovered some of its steadiness. And if you go public with the vault, with any of this, the legal questions alone will take years. Courts probate challenges international property claims. I can make your ownership of all of this extremely complicated. Miriam looked at her. I've had the vault's legal status verified by a specialist in estate law and international property custodianship, she said. The opinion runs to 43 pages. It is unambiguous. My ownership of unclaimed items is absolute under the applicable custodianship provisions, and the items I have sold were legally cleared before sale. She paused. You have no case. You have no leverage. You have a criminal record that I am currently choosing not to file. Renata went still. I am giving you a choice, Miriam said. You will sign the trucking company back to me. What remains of it, which is not much, but it is Rowan's name, and his name matters to me. You will withdraw the Nevada LLC's involvement in the environmental petition and the county assessment. You will leave the city and not return. You will not contact me, not reference this property, not take any action that touches anything associated with the Callaway name. She gathered the documents into the folder and held it. In exchange, this folder stays in this vault. No district attorney, no federal charges for financial fraud, no prosecution for the forged signatures which would carry the heaviest penalties. She set the folder on the desk between them. You will disappear completely, and in exchange, you will remain free. Renata looked at the folder. She looked at the vault around her, the cases and the cabinets, and the chandelier and the marble floor, and the amber light that had been burning faithfully down here for 100 years, keeping faith with people who had needed faithfulness more than anything else. You wanted to bury me in this forest, Miriam said quietly. You thought Rowan had left me ruins. You laughed in an attorney's office and thought you understood what you were looking at. She picked up the folder. You gave me the key to your own ending. I want you to understand that before you go. Renata looked at her for a long moment. Then I'll sign. Fletcher brought the papers the following morning. He arrived at 9, set the documents on the oak counter with the neat efficiency of a man who had prepared them, knowing they would be signed, and waited in his car while Renata went through them with her own attorney by phone. She signed at 11:17. She walked to her SUV without looking back at the station. Miriam stood in the doorway and watched the white vehicle make its way back through the forest, the sound of its engine diminishing through the trees until there was nothing left of it but the ordinary sounds of the forest doing what it had always done. Then she went back inside and made coffee. She stood at the counter with the mug in her hands and looked at the space around her. The restored floor, the carved oak, the beautiful proportions of a building that had spent a century being underestimated. And she thought about what came next with the same focused clarity she had brought to every previous stage of this. The trucking company was a diminished thing. 12 trucks remaining out of the 48 it had once run, the rest sold or encumbered the contracts in various states of disrepair. But the name was there, and the network and Sam Whitfield, who had driven for Rowan for 23 years and knew the business the way few people know anything, was still there and willing. She called Sam that afternoon. I want you to run it, she said. Day to day, hire who you need. I'll handle the financial structure and the recovery plan, but the operations are yours. A long pause. Mrs. Callaway, the company is... I know what it is, she said. I know what it was. I know the distance between those two things. Let's make it something worth knowing. Another pause. Then, Yes, ma'am. When do we start? We already have, she said. The Callaway Foundation opened its doors 4 months later. It operated from the main station building, which Miriam had expanded slightly, a small conference room added in the east corner, two offices that matched the original architecture exactly in their period details, while providing all the functionality of modern workspaces. The vintage pumps stood outside in the clearing, restored and gleaming, the only clue from the outside that this place was more than it appeared. She had hired 3 people, and she had hired them the way she had always made important decisions, carefully, slowly, with the full weight of her attention on each choice. Patricia Voss had left a corporate litigation firm after 16 years because she had grown tired of winning cases for people she knew were wrong. She was 51, methodical with a forensic understanding of financial crime that Miriam found immediately impressive. She took the foundation's cases pro bono, and she was, by any measure, extraordinarily good at it. Grady Marsh was an investigator who had spent 20 years with the Financial Crimes Division of a federal agency before taking early retirement for reasons he described briefly as philosophical. He followed paper trails with the patience of someone who understood that the trail was always there if you were willing to be more patient than the person who made it. Ruth Elkins had managed large offices for 30 years before her children, 2 of them acting together, had systematically transferred her assets into accounts she couldn't access and attempted to have her declared incompetent. She had fought back alone through 3 years of legal proceedings and won. She managed the foundation's operations with the quiet, precise efficiency of someone who understood from personal experience exactly why the work mattered. The 3 of them together were more than the sum of their parts. In the first 6 months, they helped 17 people. An elderly widower whose son had drained his retirement accounts over 4 years while maintaining a convincing performance of devotion. A retired teacher whose financial advisor had systematically redirected her savings for 11 years into accounts the advisor controlled. A group of workers, 23 of them, whose employer had embezzled their pension contributions for 8 years while filing fraudulent reports confirming the payments. Different cases, different details. The same pattern: trust exploitation, the particular devastation of being harmed by someone you had every reason to believe was on your side. Patricia recovered the money where the money was recoverable and pursued justice where it wasn't. Grady found what needed finding. Ruth made sure that every person who came through the foundation's doors felt that they had been heard and taken seriously before they left. Miriam funded it entirely from the vault, using assets that had crossed oceans in the hands of desperate people to protect others who were desperate in their own time and their own ways. It felt right in a manner she couldn't have articulated but didn't need to. It simply felt like the thing the vault had always been for the purpose that Jasper Calloway had built toward, without being able to name it exactly in the language of 1924. The chain held. She was reading on a late afternoon in the following spring, the forest outside the window newly green, the wildflowers returning to the clearing in their annual reclamation of the cracked concrete, when she heard a car on the dirt track. Not Renata's aggressive engine, something smaller, more careful, navigating the ruts with the deliberateness of someone following directions they weren't entirely certain of. The car stopped near the station, and a young woman got out and stood beside it, looking at the building with an expression Miriam had come to recognize, the particular mixture of hope and disbelief of someone who has followed a thread of family history to a place they weren't sure would be real. She always watched for a moment before she opened the door. She had learned to give people time to gather themselves before the encounter began, to let the reality of the station settle on them at their own pace. This young woman was perhaps 34. Professional clothes, the kind you wore when you came from work because you'd been too anxious to go home and change first. She carried a folder, they always carried folders, and she stood looking at the building with the expression of someone who has been holding a hope carefully for a long time and is not yet sure it's safe to put it down. Miriam opened the door before she could knock. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Miriam Calloway. You're welcome here." The young woman's shoulders dropped slightly, the involuntary relaxation of someone who has been braced for disappointment and has not received it. "Mrs. Calloway." She had a careful, precise way of speaking, British inflected at the edges. "My name is Isolde Fairfax. I believe my family may have deposited something here a long time ago." She paused. "I know that probably sounds—" "It sounds exactly like the truth," Miriam said. "Come inside, let's have tea and talk properly." Isolde's great-grandmother had been Edith Fairfax née Harrington from London. In the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe began its sustained bombing campaign over the city, Edith had made a decision that Isolde described in the way that family stories are described when they have passed through several generations, with the particular reverence of people who understand they are carrying something significant without knowing all its dimensions. She had brought a music box to America. Not a trivial object, a silver music box made in the early 19th century that had been in the Harrington family for 4 generations. Edith had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from hers, and it played a specific melody that Isolde hummed softly for a moment, in the way of someone who has heard a thing described so many times that it has become almost audible in memory. Edith had brought it to a station in the forest. She had always said, "A station in the forest," and left it with a man whose name she remembered as Mr. Calloway, and received a receipt printed on cream paper, and come back to England and survive the war, and lived to the age of 89 without ever returning for it. She always said she meant to go back, Isolde said. Her hands were around her teacup. After the war. Then there were children, and then there was money trouble, and then there was time, the way time becomes a reason not to do things when you keep moving forward without deciding. She died when I was 8. She looked at the folder in her lap. My mother didn't believe the story. She thought great-grandmother had gotten confused. But when my mother died last year, I found the receipt in a box of old papers, and I decided to try. She opened the folder and removed a piece of paper so old that Miriam could see the light through it. When Isolde held it translucent with age, the ink faded to the brown of old photographs, the paper so fragile it seemed to exist more in memory than in fact. Miriam took it gently with the care she brought to all the old documents, the care of someone who understood that the object and the history it carried were not separable things. Deposit receipt, Callaway Station, property of Edith Harrington Fairfax. Deposited August 19th, 1940. One silver music box maker unknown, circa 1820, plays traditional Scottish air. Value estimated, the rest was too faded to read. Miriam didn't need to read it. She knew every item in the vault. She set the receipt down on the counter with both hands and looked at Isolde Fairfax, 34 years old, who had come here following a thread of family story that her own mother had dismissed, who had driven to a forest on a spring afternoon with a folder of hope and the particular courage of someone willing to be wrong about something that mattered. I have it, Miriam said. The words were simple. They were the right words. She had learned over the months that this was always the right approach, not preamble, not qualification, just the truth delivered at the speed that truth deserves. Isolde's eyes filled. It's real, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. She didn't imagine it. She didn't imagine it, Miriam said. She trusted this place, and this place kept its trust. The music box has been here for 85 years, exactly where she left it, waiting for exactly this moment. She stood. Come with me. The vault received them both in its amber light. Isolde stopped at the base of the stairs and stood very still, the way Miriam had stood on her first evening, here taking in the scale and the beauty and the impossible reality of what existed beneath the forest floor. Miriam gave her the time she needed. She had learned patience in this space, the patience of something that has waited a long time and knows that waiting itself is a form of faith. All of these people, Isolde said, finally looking at the cases, the cabinets, the brass plaques with their names and dates. All of these people, Miriam agreed, they came here because they needed somewhere safe, because Jasper Calloway built this and made a promise that it would endure. And it did. She moved toward the cabinets along the wall. Your great-grandmother's deposit is in cabinet 9, drawer 4. It's been there since August of 1940. I found it 3 months after I first came here, and I've known it was waiting. She opened the drawer. The music box sat in its original wrapping cloth that had faded from white to the color of old cream tied with a ribbon that had lost most of its color, but none of its function. Miriam lifted it carefully and set it on the surface of the cabinet and unwrapped it with the same deliberateness she brought to all the objects down here. The silver was tarnished with age, but intact, the surface showing the engraving work of someone who had understood their craft. Floral patterns along the edges, a small oval on the lid that had once held a miniature and now held the ghost of one, the silver having absorbed the shape of the image it had framed for a century without the image itself remaining. Isolde reached out and then stopped, her hands hovering above the object. Go ahead, Miriam said. It's yours, Miriam said, It has always been yours. Your great-grandmother carried it across an ocean and trusted strangers to keep it safe because she hoped that someday her family would be standing exactly where you are right now. That faith was not misplaced. Open it. Isolde's fingers found the latch. The lid lifted, the mechanism still functional, the spring still holding its tension after 85 years. The music box played, a traditional Scottish air, the notes rising into the vault's amber air, with the clarity of something that had been waiting patiently to be heard. Each note was distinct and true, the mechanism untouched by time, the melody moving through the stone chamber and reflecting off the marble floor and the mahogany cabinets and the glass of the display cases and filling the space the way music fills spaces when it finally finds the room it was made for. Isolde put her hands over her mouth. She stood in the vault that Jasper Calloway had built in 1924 and listened to the music box that Edith Harrington Fairfax had carried from London in 1940 and left here in trust, and she cried. Not quietly, the full deep release of someone who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has finally found the place where it is safe to put it down. The sound of her crying echoed softly through the chamber, mixing with the music, and Miriam stood beside her with one hand on her shoulder and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the vault wasn't already saying. The music box played its full cycle and wound down to silence. Isolde lowered her hands. Her face was wet and open in the way faces sometimes become when they've been through the fullest version of a feeling. "How do I thank you?" she said. "How do I possibly?" "You already have," Miriam said, "by coming here, by honoring your great-grandmother's memory, by proving that trust kept across generations means something real." She paused. "But if you want to do something more live, well, keep faith with the people who come after you. And if you ever find someone who has been cheated or betrayed by people they should have been able to trust, help them if you can. That's how the chain stays unbroken." Isolde nodded, unable yet to speak. She held the music box against her chest, the silver that Edith had held, the mechanism that had played this melody in a London house. Before the bombs came the object that had crossed an ocean and waited 85 years in an amber-lit vault for exactly this, and she understood that she was not simply reclaiming a family heirloom. She was the completion of a circle that had been drawn in 1940 and had needed until this spring afternoon to close. Miriam climbed the marble stairs alone. She closed the vault. She reset the counter. She locked the control panel away behind the hinged surface and pressed the carved symbol until the counter returned to its position. The mechanism silent and smooth, this whole sequence as natural now as locking a door. She moved through the station, her home, her purpose, and turned off the interior lights one by one until only the lamp by the window remained. She unlocked the red door and stepped outside. The spring evening had settled fully into the clearing while she and Isolde were below. The sky above the tree line was the color that comes after sunset, but before dark, a deep, saturated blue that held the last of the light without quite surrendering it. The wildflowers in the cracked concrete had opened through the day and not yet closed. The vintage pumps stood at the edge of the canopy, restored and gleaming, their compass displays visible in the fading light through their dusty glass, those beautiful misdirections, those perfect markers of what lay beneath. Miriam stood beside the station and breathed the evening air. She thought about Rowan writing his letter at his desk 3 weeks before he died, choosing each word with the care he always brought to written things. She thought about Jasper standing in this clearing in 1924, with whatever he had built and whatever he had understood about what the world was going to need from him, making a promise to people he would never meet. She thought about Renata somewhere, Florida she had heard through the reliable unpredictability of mutual connections, which seemed right, somehow a place of reinvention and erasure. She thought about Isolde Fairfax driving carefully down the dirt track with the music box secured in the passenger seat, carrying 85 years of kept faith back to a family that had almost stopped believing. She thought about the 16 other families that Jasper's records listed as having descendants. She had located 16 more circles waiting to close, 16 more moments like the one she had just witnessed, pending only time and the continued patience of this place. She thought about the 17 people the foundation had helped in its first 6 months, and the cases currently active, and the ones that would come, because they would come, they always came because the world produced people who had been betrayed by those they trusted at a rate that showed no signs of decreasing, and someone needed to be the answer to that. She thought about being 68 years old and standing in a forest clearing in the spring evening, knowing exactly who she was and exactly what she was for. Rowan had known. He had known before she did, had known it clearly enough to build his final act around it, to make her the keeper of the thing that mattered most. He had trusted her with the hardest thing, the most important thing, the thing that required everything she actually was. She had not wasted it. She reached up and touched the necklace at her throat. Helena Rothschild's diamonds warmed from her skin, catching the last of the evening light, and then she went back inside. She closed the red door softly behind her. The forest settled into its nighttime sounds around the station. The pump stood in the clearing. The vault breathed its cool cedar-scented air 60 feet below, holding its amber light and its kept promises in the music box drawer in Cabinet 9, now empty, after 85 years finally returned to the family that had trusted this place with it. The silence of the station was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of purpose fully found. The answer had been in the silence all along, just as Rowan had promised.